Hear the word of the Lord this morning. Exodus chapter 25, starting with chapter 24. The glory of the Lord settled down on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day, the Lord called to Moses from inside the cloud. To the Israelites at the foot of the mountain, the glory of the Lord appeared at the summit like a consuming fire. Then Moses disappeared into the cloud as he climbed higher up the mountain. He remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to bring me their sacred offerings. Accept the contributions from all whose hearts are moved to offer them. Here is a list of sacred offerings you may accept from them: gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet thread, fine linen and goat hair for cloth, tanned ram skins and fine goat skin leather, acacia wood, olive oil for the lamps, spices for the anointing oil and the fragrant incense, onyx stones and other gemstones to be set in the ephod and the priest's chest piece. Have the people of Israel build me a holy sanctuary so I can live among them. You must build this tabernacle and its furnishings exactly according to the pattern I will show you." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. When Amanda and I were on our honeymoon, we get to go to Cozumel, Mexico, and we went to the Mayan ruins there. And I have a couple memories from there. You know, the Mayan ruins there were a number of sites there I was interested to see about how they worshiped and some of the ways they did things. I remember the extremely large mosquitoes that were there and trying to eat us alive. The small iguana that my wife will tell you was a dragon that was trying to eat her alive. And then piles of stones. That's what they were. You know, they would tell us, like, this is where they worshipped, or this was an altar, but if you didn't tell me what they were just piles of rocks, right? Piles of stones. Later in life, we get to go to Chichen Itza and see some of the Mayan ruins there, and those were much fancier piles of stones, if you've ever been there. They were much more beautiful, but yet still piles of stones, right? In Washington, D.C., we get to go to the National Cathedral. It's a beautiful sanctuary. Get to walk through it and see everything that was there. And beautiful place. But at the end of the day, it's just piles of stones. And then we went to California, to the Mission San Juan Capistrano. And there is what's called the Great Stone Church. This mission was built in 1776. It's as old as our country. It's been active the whole time it's been there. And it's this beautiful stone church that's there. That's as old as this mission. The stained glass, everything that's in there is just like nothing you've ever seen before. And yet at the end of the day, literally a pile of stones. I've been in churches all across this country, from old Quaker meeting houses to huge mega churches, and preached and done weddings and every kind of church you can imagine. And at the end of the day, every single one of them is, including this building, is just piles of stones. It's just material. It's just a building. There's only one thing that can ever give any of those piles of stones or those buildings any kind of significance, any kind of meaning. It's not how they're built. It's not how old they are. It's not even what's done there. It's whether or not the presence of God is in that place. It is God being there that gives them meaning. It's God being there that gives them purpose. It's God being there that gives them life. All of these things only have meaning if God is in them. And so, as we've been journeying through Exodus, and we're now at this point where we see, if we're fast forwarding a little bit from chapter 20, Moses has come down from the mountain and he's read the commitments, and the people have agreed to them. They've taken their vows. They said, yes, we're in. We're going to do this. And Moses is now going back up the mountain to get more commands for God to further flesh out how we're going to live this out. Because let's be honest, when you got married, did you have it all figured out day one after the wedding? No. You had to then start figuring out, okay, how are we going to live together, right? And that's what God and the people are doing here. How are we going to do this? How are we going to move forward together? And so here, the first thing that God begins to tell them is, here is how we are going to build a life together where you can worship me. And so as we look in these next few chapters about how God begins to design how his presence will be known among them, we can ask in our own lives, how do we see and know and experience the presence of God among us? As we look at the commitments they make to worship God today, we're going to see the intent of God's heart and that God is calling his people to worship him. But not just to worship him. God is calling his people to design their lives so that he can be with them and make his presence known to them. So let's start with this question we've asked throughout this series. What's the commandment? What is God actually commanding them to do? And in the passage we read, there's two very simple things. The first isn't really a commandment, as we'll look. At first, God asks for an offering. He doesn't require it. It's not a command. I want you to notice. God doesn't say, you all have to give me these things. God says, to those whose hearts are willing and moved, to those whose hearts are ready, here's what I am asking for you to bring to me. And he has a specific list that we read. And those lists, as we read them, you can see, have a specific purpose. That God has a use for them in his command that's coming next. When we get to verse 8, he gives them a command to build him a holy place. A word that we commonly translate as tabernacle. Build him a church, right? So the first question we ask is this: what is a tabernacle? What does that mean? Here in Exodus, the tabernacle is very simply for them a church that can move, right? It's a tent. So there's a circus going on up at the mall, right? And there's a huge tent there. And so we understand that circus isn't there 365 days a year. They'll pack that tent up and they'll go take the circus somewhere else. The circus doesn't change. It's going to move. It's contained inside that tent. And so what happens here is we have a people who don't have a land yet, who don't have a home yet. They're essentially nomads. And so God is saying, you're going to journey, you're going to travel. This is a way that you can take me with you in this place to worship me. And all the things within it can be designed so that I can travel with you, so that I'm wherever you are. So the tabernacle is essentially a traveling church. It's a tent where they can continue to do all the things that God's going to ask them to do. It's not just any tent. God has specific plans, specific designs, and we'll see there's a number of specific things that he wants in it. But it represents God's dwelling place. So the question that we've asked throughout this is, what do these commands teach us about God? So what does this command teach us about who God is? It's a simple yet important lesson. As we see here in verse 8, God doesn't just say, build me a house, right? Build me a church. Build me a tabernacle. Why are they building a tabernacle? So that I can live among you. Now, I don't want you to read that the wrong way. This is not God saying, I need a home, and I need you to build me a house. The tabernacle is not God's house. It's not where he dwells. It's not where he lives. God is saying, this is the place where I will make my presence known to you. Here's why this is so important for these people at this time, and it's important still for us today too. So when I went to college, I knew I was going into ministry. I just turned 18, and I didn't feel like I needed to go to college. I already knew everything. Like I had everything figured out, right? going to study to be in ministry, and like I'd won every Sunday school contest there had ever been in my life. So like I know the Bible. What are you going to teach me about it? So when I go, I had a very specific plan to be done in 3 years. And part of that plan was I was going to take this upper level theology class as my very first class. And my advisor says, don't do that. You can't do that. And I said, I have to. If I don't do this, you can only take it at certain times. They're lined up certain ways. I need to take it to take other classes, so I'm taking it first. So I did. And I sit down in this class, ready to tell them how it all works. And this real slight German guy comes to the front. And at the start of the class, he says this, and I'm not even going to try his accent. Is God immanent, or is he transcendent? And I looked around like, are those German words? Because I know everything there is to know, and I have no idea what he just asked or said. And he asked that question because it's the most important question that we can ask God, and it's the question that God is answering right here. So I'm going to tell you what those words mean and why they're so important. In this moment, we have to understand this in this passage. God is transcendent. And what that means is God is like above us and beyond us and bigger than us. God has, what do we read at the beginning of this in chapter 24? There's a cloud that's come down on this mountain. And the glory of God has settled on this mountain to the point where we're going to read later, the people have to be backed away from it, right? They can't come near. God is so great. He's so big. He's so powerful. He's so holy. They have to stay away. And so what God has done here is said, yes, that's true of who I am. But he wants to make sure that they know they don't have to come back to that mountain to be with God. That's not where God lives. That's not his domain. Instead, he says, I want you to build a tabernacle so I can be immanent, so I can be close to you, down on your level. And yet there's a tension that both are true at the same time, right? That God is this great God who's powerful, who's holy, who's just, who's all the things that God is so much greater and bigger than we are. And yet he lives here amongst us and can somehow do that without sacrificing that holiness and that glory. That's what God is trying to tell them about himself. I'm not a God who lives up on the mountain. I'm a God who lives with my people. And I'm present among you. And wherever you go, I'm going with you. And he wanted that tabernacle to be a constant reminder. Now, the truth was God had been with them all the time already, right? God was with them when they were slaves in Egypt. And God was with them when he was freeing them from Egypt, doing all the powerful things that needed to be done for him to do that. And God was with them when they got to the Red Sea, and he parted that sea to free them, and then he used that sea to destroy their enemies. He was there too. And then he was with them on the other side of that sea when they had no food to eat, and they had no water to drink, and he provided for them. He was with them when they met enemies and defeated them. Every step of their journey, God had been there. And he says, now I want you to build something so that there's never a day, never a place you go where you don't forget, I'm with you. No matter where you are, I'm there too. Fighting for you. Present with you. It's one of the most important lessons that we can learn about God. Because too often we think somehow we have to go find God up on a mountain somewhere because he's so great and he's God, and that's true. But Jesus came to be with us. So we don't have to go searching for him. Wherever you are, he's there too. It's not a matter of moving our lives somewhere to find him. It's a matter of allowing our hearts to be open to seeing him and where he's at right now in this moment. So, as we journey forward here, I want you to see how God is making his presence known. Starting in the next passages in chapter 25. And this is 2 chapters long, so we're not going to read all this. I encourage you, you can go back and read it and look at specific instructions. Make sure that what I say is in there, and I'm not adding to anything in Scripture. But there's 7 things in the tabernacle I just want to go through really quickly that God makes his presence known with. First, he gives them instructions on how to build the Ark of the Covenant. This is something that's well known, especially if you're an Indiana Jones fan. You've heard of this. You know what it is, right? The Ark was, first of all, was something where they put some special things like a jar of manna, the 10 Commandments, the actual stones, Aaron's rod that budded that made him the high priest. These things were all in the ark. They were reminders of God's power and presence. So the ark contained that. But more importantly, as God describes here in chapter 25, he talks to them about how to build the mercy seat, how to build the covering for that ark. And he tells them it's on that covering where once a year on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest comes in, he's going to sprinkle blood on there, and my presence, the presence you see up on that mountain, is going to be on that mercy seat. Because God knew that while he was holy, his people weren't. And that blood made it able for him to come and be with his people, and to bring the fullness of his holiness there in their presence for that, at least for that moment. And so at that mercy seat, God meets his people. I'm telling you, I'm going to meet you here at the point of my mercy. And so God makes his presence known to them through his mercy. He makes a way for him, in spite of who they are, to be with them, to be present among them. God's presence then right outside where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. It was called the most holy place. Then there's the holy place, and outside there was what was called the table of bread. Wood table covered in gold. Ark of the Covenant was wood covered in gold. And that table had 12 loaves of bread on it. And those 12 loaves of bread, there was one for each tribe of Israel. It symbolized that every tribe had a place at God's table. They all belonged to God's people. But that bread was there to also remind them that God was present in providing for them. That everything that they had every day, every breath that they took, everything that they ate, everything that they drank was a reminder of God's presence in their lives. That God was giving them what they needed to sustain them in life. So God reminds them of his provision and his presence through that. Next to that table was a golden lampstand, 75-pound pure gold lamp. And that reminded them of God because that lamp gave light to darkness. And that lamp, the light of that lamp reminded the people that God is light. And that while their lives may be dark, God is there to shed his light onto those dark places and in those dark situations that they might face. So as they come forward to worship him there in that holy place, they're reminded of the light that God brings to their lives. God's presence is seen in the structure of the tabernacle. As God in chapter 26 tells them, he has a specific design for them to build it. He doesn't just want a tent, any tent. He says, here's how I want you to build this. So again, there's an inner court, the most holy place. It's where the high priest went once a year. Then there's a holy place where other priests could go in at other times. And then outside of that, there was a courtyard. Everybody could come into that courtyard. But all of these different places are separated with curtains. And those curtains were important. And in some ways, we think of those curtains as God was separating himself in his holiness from the unholy people, right? God couldn't take their sin. That's not really true. It's the opposite. God was protecting his people with those curtains from his holiness. Because they were unholy, they couldn't come into that presence. And so those curtains were there to protect them. So God reminds them, even in the midst of that he is there to protect them and he will bring them what they need to keep them from some of the harm that they could potentially face in life. God is present in his protection. Then outside of that, in the courtyard, there was an altar, a bronze altar. We're outside the holy places are all gold. And then we move to the outside, we have more common metal, bronze, wooden altar. 7.5 foot long, 7.5 foot wide, 4.5 foot high. It's a big altar. And that altar was where people would come and they would make all the sacrifices that God asks of them. All the other things in the laws, from the animal sacrifices to the grain sacrifices, from sacrifices for sin to sacrifices for thanksgiving, they're all made there on that altar. And that altar there is to remind them that God has given them a way to find forgiveness. God is present in their thanksgiving. And we're going to take communion later today, a symbol that God has given us to remind us of the same thing. We don't need an altar anymore. That Jesus has sacrificed himself to bridge that gap for us, that we might overcome our unholiness and live in the presence of God. The court of the tabernacle shows God's presence, because the tabernacle was placed in the middle of the camp. Wherever they went, they would set up this camp right. Wherever they set up the camp, the tabernacle was always in the middle. And the curtains in the courts reminded them that God was protecting them from his holiness. And God didn't want separation from his people. He wanted, in spite of their unholiness, God still wanted to live at the center of their lives. And he wanted to provide them an opportunity to come to him. And that courtyard was the place where they could come and they could gather in his presence. So the people are experiencing in this passage this very thing as they stand at the bottom of the mountain. They can't climb the mountain. They can't come up into that cloud. And yet they still can come close enough to see it and experience what God is doing. Finally, the last command is for them to bring oil. It says it's got to be olive oil. It's got to be pure pressed from olives. And that oil was important for this reason, because that lamp didn't have electricity. Right? It needed fuel to burn. But not just to burn when they were in there. That lamp was to be lit all the time. It was an ever-present light. And so it was a reminder that God's presence is constant and never ends. It's always with us. There's never a time of day where it gets turned off or shut off, that God is always there. So God designs this tabernacle and this court and everything to remind these people that he is present, that he wants to be present, and he'll do what it takes to be present in their lives. So the question for us is, what does that mean for us? And the obvious answer is, the same thing's true. The same God that was there in Exodus is here today, right? And God has done everything necessary to be present in your life. And no matter where you go, he's there. And he wants to be there, wants you to know his presence. But there's one really important thing that I think we need to notice for us to experience that presence. Before they could build this tabernacle, what did they have to do? They had to follow the first instruction, right? Which wasn't a command, it was a request. They had to sacrifice. They had to surrender that gold. They had to surrender those linens. They had to surrender those things they had so this could be built. Surrender of ourselves is necessary for us to know and experience the fullness of the presence of God in our lives. Until we are willing to surrender, until we're ready to give of our hearts, and to give our hearts, we can't fully know the power and presence of God in our lives. It requires sacrifices. Now, note this, a lot of experts, these air quotes there, experts suggest the tabernacle didn't really exist. I mean, these people were slaves. They didn't have any money. They didn't have gold and riches. They didn't have that stuff to give, right? So this didn't really happen. They didn't really have to sacrifice anything. It's been a while since we read this passage, but I'm going to read Exodus 12 to you. And Exodus 12 is when the Israelites finally leave Egypt. And it says that the people of Israel did as Moses had instructed. They asked the Egyptians for clothing and articles of silver and gold. The Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites, and they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. God had already provided a way for them to give what they needed to give to do this. God had already given them all these things. He doesn't take them from them. He doesn't require it. He says, now, from what I've provided for you, I need for you to sacrifice so that my presence can be made known. So here is how surrender, how sacrifice allows the presence of God to be known in our lives. I want you to think of it in these 4 ways. Number 1, surrender means I give up control to God. So I'm giving up what's mine and saying, here, it's yours, God, and now you're in control of it. I no longer get to control where it goes and what it does. If you want to see God's presence in your life, you have to hand over what's yours to him so that he can use what's yours to work in your lives. That's how you'll see his presence. Second, surrender means I'm seeking God's will. I'm saying, God, I'm no longer deciding what's done with this. I'm putting it in your hands, and I want your direction. I want you to show me what it is you want for my life. And when we follow God's will, that's when we see the fullness of God's presence. When we're seeking after him and we surrender to his will, then we get to see the fullness of who he is in our lives. Surrender then allows us to experience the gift of God's presence. You see, when we give, when we surrender, we sacrifice, whatever word you want to use, we look at it as we're losing. I'm giving up something, right? But what God is telling them is you're not losing anything, you're gaining something. Jesus told us this. Those who hold on to the things of their life will lose it. And those who surrender their lives will gain it. It's through that surrender that we think we're losing, but God says, now that you've emptied your heart of all these things, now I can fill it with all the things of my kingdom. Now your heart's ready to receive my grace, my joy, my peace, my love, all that I have to give to you. We're surrendering our hearts to be filled with him. And finally, surrender enables us to see the power of God's presence in us. It's through our willingness to surrender ourselves to God's presence that he is made known. People see God when you give of yourselves, when you give of what's yours. This is how people see God in their lives, because you are willing to give, to surrender, to sacrifice of what is yours. Not because God is making you, but because you're saying, my heart has been moved in such a way that I'm willing to let go of this and let God do what he will with it. And people get to see God work in their lives in that way. We should be moved to give because we want to surrender ourselves to God. We want to surrender ourselves to the God who surrendered himself for us. So how does this point us to Jesus? The question we asked throughout this series. How does a tabernacle point us to Jesus? Well, listen to what Hebrews 3 says, verse 5 and 6. Moses was certainly faithful in God's house as a servant. His work was an illustration of the truths God would reveal later. But Christ, as the Son, is in charge of God's entire house. And we are God's house if we keep our courage and remain confident in our hope in Christ. So he says, Moses was faithful as a servant, and his work pointed to things that would be revealed later. All the things that he's doing in the tabernacle are meant to point to truths that God is going to reveal in their fullness later. And then he says, who and how were those truths revealed? Through Jesus Christ. All the lessons that we talk about learning in the tabernacle, we know from Jesus. Because he is the light of the world who shines into the darkness of our lives. And he is the bread of life. And all who eat of him will never be hungry again, but will find eternal life. Jesus has become the Ark of the Covenant, him in whom the power and presence of God fully dwell. Him who goes before us and protects us in the midst of battles of life. Jesus didn't become the altar. He got rid of the need for an altar because he became the final sacrifice, one for all. And his blood was shed so that we no longer would need an altar ever again, anywhere. We no longer have a mercy seat. The cross has become the mercy seat, that place where God's presence is known through the blood of Jesus. That place where our unholiness can meet the holiness of God. And we can become one with him. We no longer have veils and curtains, because when Jesus breathed his last and said it is finished, that veil was torn in two. so that we would know that through the death of Jesus Christ, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God that we have seen in Jesus Christ. He got rid of that separation, and we can now live every day fully in His presence. Jesus was the tabernacle. John 1:14 tells us this. The Word became flesh, the Word became human, and He made His home among us. Go back to this, to verse 8 of Exodus 25. Build me a holy sanctuary. Why? So I can live among you. Jesus became flesh. That was His tent. Why? So He could live among us. The word there literally means tabernacle. We tabernacled among us. He came and dwelled with us, and all the glory and power and love of God was contained in Him. He made God's presence known to us in a way that no pile of stones ever could. So now today, we know who God is. And we are able to live in His presence because Jesus has made His tabernacle in our hearts. And we are now His dwelling place. And His presence goes with us everywhere. We can surrender our hearts to Him willingly. And when we open our hearts to that, we know that now, as we open our hearts to Him, we are not losing anything, but we are gaining the fullness of His abundant life and of the grace and peace and joy and love that He has for us. So we can share that with the world. So everyone might know the presence of God. So everyone would know that Jesus has become nothing. So that nothing can separate us from the presence of God in our lives ever again. When I was in seminary, I was studying youth ministry. And there was this company called Youth Specialties. They did these big conferences. And they would come to our seminary, and they would do them before they would do the big national ones. They would try them out on us students. So they would kind of work and get feedback from us. So it was the first time I went to this conference. I was the youngest guy there by far. And I'm sitting at this table with my classmates, and there's maybe 20 people at this thing. This is a conference where like thousands of people come to it. We're the test subjects, right? So we're sitting there, and we're listening to the seminars, and they're asking for feedback. They're doing all the things they do. And there's this guy who's not in our class at my table, and he's a lot older, and he's a little weird, and I don't know who this guy is that I'm sitting next to. And so we're on a break, and I turn to one of my classmates. I'm like, does anybody know who this guy is? He's like in his 60s. He just showed up out of nowhere. Who is this guy? And they're like, that's Mike Yaconelli. He's the president of Youth Specialties. He like runs the whole thing. He started it all. And so now I feel like a total idiot, right? And so I treat this guy differently and start talking to him. But what was so compelling about that for me was here's this guy. He was like in charge of this huge national organization, and I'd sat next to him for hours, and I had no idea because he was that humble. He was that genuine of a person. He didn't think he was better than anybody else. He lived that way. In fact, he was a pastor at the same time as he ran that of a small rural church in Northern California that he famously always said was the slowest growing church in America. Like he was just the most humble, down to earth, quirky guy you could ever meet. And so when I was done with seminary, he was releasing a book. And I was real excited to read it, having get to interact with him a couple times, knowing who he was. And he called it Messy Spirituality. And this book, one, is an amazing book. It was profound to me to read and just see a guy be open and honest with his messiness. Even more so because Mike died a year after that in a car accident. So it was the last thing he ever wrote. And it becomes almost like his eulogy, like him talking about his life and his pursuit of Jesus. And so he begins the book by saying, I'm a mess. And here I am. I'm this pastor and this leader. I'm this Christian figure. And I try as hard as I can to live the right life. And I'm pursuing Jesus with everything that I am. And man, I'm just an utter failure at it. And my life is just a mess. He says, in fact, I have a recurring dream. And in the recurring dream, he is walking behind Jesus. Jesus is leading a group of people. And he says, in the dream, I'm walking behind him thinking, I hope he asks me to be his disciple today. And in the dream, after a while, he says, Jesus turns around and locks eyes with me. And he says, follow me. And my heart begins to race. And I start running towards him. And then Jesus says, oh, I'm sorry. I was talking to the guy behind you. That's how Mike saw his life in pursuit of Jesus. It was messy. And he says the truth is we're all messy like that. None of us is very good at this pursuing Jesus thing. He said, so my life's a mess, so I wrote a book about spirituality and what it means to pursue Jesus. Because we're all a mess. But it's how he defines the spirituality that I want you to hear today. Because I think we can all identify with that. The messiness that is our pursuit of God. That we're all a mess. But he says spirituality is not a formula. It's not a test. It's a relationship. Spirituality is not about competency. It is about intimacy. Spirituality is not about perfection. It is about connection. The way of spiritual life begins where we are now in the mess of our lives. Accepting the reality of our broken, flawed lives is the beginning of spirituality. Not because the spiritual life will remove our flaws, but because we let go of seeking perfection and instead seek God, the one who was present in the tangledness of our lives. Spirituality is not about being fixed. It is about God being present in the mess of our unfixedness. I want you to think about that tabernacle as the worship team comes forward to lead us here in a moment. That tabernacle sitting in the center of Israel's camp. And God's presence cloaked in curtains, unattainable to the messy people. They can go into his presence for one moment, one day, every year. That's it. That's how much of a mess that they are. God's presence in their camp, everywhere they went, reminded them of that messiness, of their imperfection. And in spite of that truth, God still wanted them to know he was there, that he was present in the midst of that mess. Their commitment to him was not a pursuit of perfection. It was not saying we're going to be perfect in following these commitments to you. It was a pursuit of connection. And even when they were as messy as they could be, God was still there. And so today, before we go to the communion table, and we're reminded that Jesus went to the cross because of how big of a mess our lives are, so that our unholiness could be filled with the holiness of God. This song is our prayer that says, I surrender. That we surrender our mess into his hands so that we can know his presence. That we surrender our hearts to him so that we can know more of who he is and more of what he wants, so that he can breathe his life into us and fill us. Surrender is not loss. Surrender is gaining Christ. So maybe this be the prayer of our hearts today in the midst of our messiness. May we bring it all to him. And may he connect who he is to us in spite of who we are. Surrender yourselves to him today. And may he tabernacle in your heart in this moment. Let's stand and surrender ourselves to him.